June 22nd, 1941, Krasna Bor village, west of Minsk, Belarusian SSR. That summer was stifling, the air thick enough to chew. Anna Ivanovna had just turned the cow out onto the meadow beyond the village when the first engines growled in the distance. She was 42, but the sun and endless labor had carved her face deep. Her back no longer straightened all the way, and her hands were cracked like old clay. Her husband Ivan had left for the front on the very first day of the war and vanished somewhere near Grodno. She stayed behind with 3 children and a frail mother-in-law who could barely walk. The Germans came without warning. Motors, shouts, shots. Anna Ivanovna managed to shove the children into the root cellar and cover the hatch with boards. She herself ran out into the street just to see what was happening. She saw gray-green uniforms dragging people from their houses, saw the village elder Pyotr being beaten with rifle butts because he hadn't come out to greet them with bread and salt. They spotted her almost at once. A young officer in a black SS uniform pointed his pistol at her and barked something. 2 soldiers grabbed her arms. She didn't struggle. She already knew it was pointless. She only asked in Russian, "For what?" No one answered. That is how she became the common prisoner of 5 men, Hans, Kurt, Otto, Franz, and Willy, all from the same company, all between 23 and 28. Later, she would remember their faces better than her own children's. First, they took her to the old school that now served as headquarters. An officer wrote something for a long time, then waved his hand. She was handed over to the 5 with 2 words, "Für die Mannschaft," for the men. She didn't speak German, but the smirks told her everything. They kept her in the school cellar, damp, smelling of mold and last year's potatoes. Hands tied with rope, feet left free so she could walk. They fed her scraps, crusts of hard bread, sometimes a gnawed piece of sausage they hadn't finished. Water came from the same tin cup the 5 drank from, then her. The first night she spent curled on the cold floor. Hans, the oldest of them, came down with a torch. He looked at her for a long time, then untied her hands so she could undress. She didn't scream. No one would hear. She only whispered the prayers her grandmother had taught her long ago. That is how it began. Every night, one of them came down. Sometimes 2. She stopped counting days, stopped counting them. She only memorized faces in case she lived long enough to recognize even one again. By day, she worked, scrubbed the floors where they slept, washed their uniforms in ice-cold water, and peeled potatoes until her fingers bled from the lye they gave her instead of soap. When she peeled too slowly, Kurt, the red-haired freckled one, hit her across the back with his belt. Not hard enough to leave marks the officer would notice, but hard enough for the skin to burn for hours.
One day in August, the company received orders to move east. The 5 didn't want to leave their woman. The officer shrugged. It was all the same to him. They threw her into the back of a lorry among crates and fuel drums, tied her ankles so she couldn't jump, and tossed her into a corner. That was how she traveled with them. On the road, they stopped and burned out villages. Sometimes they dragged her out to cook over an open fire. She stood barefoot on scorching earth, cutting fat back with a dull knife while they sat around laughing. Franz, the youngest, kept photographing her with an old Leica, für zu Hause, for home. In September, they reached Smolensk and quartered in a half-ruined house on the outskirts. It had a cellar. That became her place. They no longer tied her. There was nowhere to run. The city was surrounded, Germans everywhere, and she barely had strength left to stand. Winter 1941-42 was cruel. Bitter frosts, hoarfrost on the cellar walls. Her clothes rotted off her body. They gave her an old greatcoat so full of lice it was heavier than the wool. Food got worse. Soup made of frozen potatoes, sometimes horse meat. She swelled with hunger. Her legs broke out in sores. Hans, the eldest, sometimes brought her an extra piece of bread, said nothing, just set it down and left. She never thanked him. She couldn't. She simply ate. Spring 1942, the company moved toward Vyazma again. She was loaded back into a truck. On the way, they came under air attack. One bomb exploded close. The truck overturned. She was thrown into the snow and couldn't get up. The wounded screamed around her. Then someone grabbed her collar. Otto. He dragged her to him and covered her with his body. Not out of pity. He simply didn't want to lose his property. That was how she stayed alive.
April 1942. Near Vyazma, the village of Novoselki turned into a transit point. The bombing had cut the company nearly in half. Of the 5, 4 remained: Hans, Kurt, Otto, Franz. Willie had been torn apart by a direct hit. They didn't even bury him, just rolled the body into a crater and covered it with snow. Anna Ivanovna watched through a crack in another truck's side. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. In Novoselki, they put the remnants of the company into an old collective farm cattle shed. It stank of manure and rotting hay. The roof leaked, puddles stood in the corners. They gave her a corner behind a plank partition where calves used to be kept. It was a little warmer. The walls were daubed with clay. They threw her a ragged burlap sack instead of a mattress and blanket riddled with bullet holes. Now she cooked for the 30 or so men left. She rose before anyone, lit the huge pot-bellied stove, boiled frozen potatoes with a bit of fat. New blisters rose on her hands from the red-hot handle. When she fainted from hunger, Kurt kicked her with his boot and shouted, "Los Russes Sao!" In May, they brought new prisoners, about 20 women and teenagers from nearby villages. Anna Ivanovna saw them when they were marched out to work. One girl, maybe 16, with huge frightened eyes, suddenly rushed to her and hugged her. It was Tanya, a neighbor from Krasny Bor. Anna Ivanovna pushed her away. They mustn't be seen knowing each other. Later, when the guard looked away, she whispered, "Have you seen my children?" Tanya shook her head. After that, they never spoke again. Summer 1942. The Germans started digging defenses. Prisoners were driven to dig trenches and anti-tank ditches. Anna Ivanovna was left with the company. But now it wasn't just the 4 who came to her. Others came too, especially after vodka rations. Hans tried to chase them off once or twice, but Kurt only laughed. "She's common property anyway." And so it went. She stopped seeing faces. She simply closed her eyes and waited for it to be over. In August, she realized she was pregnant. She never knew whose. Her belly grew quickly. She was already skin and bone. When it began to show, Kurt punched her in the stomach so hard she fell. Then again. On the 3rd day, the bleeding started. She lay on the burlap for 3 days, unable to stand. Franz brought a rag soaked in cold water and laid it on her forehead. No one else came near.
She lost the child. The bleeding went on, and stopped. She thought she would die. She didn't. Autumn 1942, the front crept closer. Distant artillery rumbled at night. The Germans grew nervous, drank more, fought among themselves. One night, Hans and Otto fought over her and fought to the death. Otto stabbed Hans in the throat. Hans died instantly. The field police took Otto and hanged him the next day in the schoolyard. The body hung there a week until it turned black. Only 2 were left, Kurt and Franz. Kurt grew even meaner. He beat her every day for no reason. Once he smashed her nose so blood poured down her chest. Franz watched in silence. When Kurt left, Franz brought a piece of gauze from a first aid packet and helped wipe the blood away. December 1942, the order came to retreat. They burned everything they could and moved west. Anna Ivanovna was thrown into a truck again, this time with the wounded. It was 35 below. Her toes froze, turned black, began to rot. She cut 3 toes off her left foot herself with a kitchen knife she found in a crate. She hardly felt pain, only warm blood running. At Orsha, they unloaded her. The company went on by train. She stayed because she could no longer walk. Kurt wanted to shoot her, but Franz said, "Let the bitch die on her own." They left. She was thrown into the cellar of a bombed house on the edge of town. She lay there almost a month, drank snow, gnawed frozen potatoes she found under the rubble. Her legs swelled, gangrene crept higher. She prepared to die. But in February 1943, our troops entered Orsha. First she heard Russian voices and couldn't believe it. Then the cellar door was broken open, and a soldier in a quilted jacket stood in the opening with a submachine gun. He shone his torch and shouted, "There's a woman alive down here!" They pulled her out, wrapped her in a greatcoat, took her to the field hospital.
February 1943, Field Hospital number 2147, Orsha Central Station. They carried her in on a stretcher wrapped in a captured blanket. The doctor, an elderly major, took one look at her feet, swore under his breath, and ordered the operating theater prepared. Both feet were black to the ankles, pus streaming. She lost consciousness on the table when they poured pure spirit into her vein instead of anesthetic. She woke 3 days later. The left leg was gone below the knee, the right to mid-calf. Instead of bandages, yellow paper soaked in foul-smelling ointment. An old woman lay beside her with one arm missing, whispering over and over, "You're alive, dear, alive." She stayed in hospital until May 1943. At first, she spoke to no one. Then, little by little, she answered questions. Gave her name, Anna Ivanovna Kovaleva, born 1900, village of Krasny Bor, Minsk district. She knew nothing of her children or her husband. When the nurse asked how she had ended up with the Germans, she stared at the ceiling and said one word, captivity. In May 1943, they discharged her with crude wooden stumps and a certificate, war disabled, second group. Sent her deep into the rear to Chelyabinsk in evacuation. She rode in a cattle wagon with wounded men and refugees. Someone gave her a piece of bread, someone a mug of hot water. She took them without a word. In Chelyabinsk, they put her in a workers' hostel near the factory, gave her a cot in the corner by the stove. She couldn't work, there were no proper prosthetics and no strength left. She lived on rations and whatever the women in the barracks shared. At night, she screamed in her sleep so loudly the whole place awoke. They moved her from corner to corner until finally they put her cot in the corridor by the door so she wouldn't disturb anyone. In 1944, a letter came from the military registration office. Husband, Ivan Sergeyevich Kovalov, missing in action, July 1941. No more letters ever came. May 1945, victory. In the hostel they sang, cried, drank raw spirit. Anna Ivanovna sat on her cot and looked out the window. Outside it was May, lilacs in bloom, yet she could still smell that cattle shed near Vyazma. In 1946, they finally made her real prosthetics, leather cups with wooden blocks. She learned to walk again, first holding the wall, then with a stick. The first time she stepped outside after 5 years, she wept from the sunlight and from being alive. In 1947, her youngest daughter Zina found her. She was 12 then. Partisans had pulled the children out of the cellar a week after the Germans took their mother. The old mother-in-law starved to death in the winter of '42. The 2 older children joined the partisans and were both killed in 1944. Zina had been alone, passed from orphanage to orphanage until the Red Cross found her mother's address. They met at Chelyabinsk railway station. Zina threw her arms around her and couldn't let go. Anna Ivanovna stroked her hair and did not cry. Tears had dried up long ago in that school cellar. In 1950, they returned to Belarus. Krasny Bor had burned to the ground. Only the foundation of their house remained. They dug an earth hut first, then built a small log house. Anna Ivanovna worked as a kolkhoz bookkeeper, sat in the office writing numbers in a ledger. Her legs ached constantly, especially when the weather changed. In 1956, she was awarded the Order of the Patriotic War, second class, and a pension of 280 rubles, real money in those days. She bought Zina a winter coat and herself a new pair of felt boots. She never had another child. After everything, her body refused.
Zina grew up, married, gave her 2 grandsons. Anna Ivanovna looked after them, taught them how to bake pancakes, and taught them to keep quiet when they asked about the war. She never told anyone, not Zina, not the grandchildren, not the neighbors. Only once in 1975, when a film crew came to make a documentary about partisans, she stepped onto the porch and said, "Don't film me, I wasn't a partisan." Then she went back inside. In 1985, for the 40th anniversary of victory, the village Soviet came asking her to speak to school children. She refused. The chairman asked quietly, "Anna Ivanovna, how did you survive at all?" She looked at him for a long time and answered, "I don't know. God must not have wanted me yet." She died in August 1991, on the hottest day of the year, quietly in her sleep. Zina found her in the morning, lying on her back, hands folded on her breast, a piece on her face she had almost never worn in life. They buried her in the village cemetery beside the empty graves of her husband and children. On the stone they wrote simply, "Kovaleva Anna Ivanovna, 1900-1991. She lived." And no one in the village ever knew what that woman had endured during 4 years of German captivity. She took it all with her.
August 1991 to May 2005, the same village of Krasny Bor. Zina buried her mother on a sweltering day when the ground itself seemed to steam. About 30 people came to the funeral. Neighbors, old kolkhoz women, a few men who could still walk without a stick. No one wept loudly. Belarusians don't usually cry in front of others. They simply stood with heads bowed and waited while the grave diggers hammered the last nail into the plain wooden cross. After the wake, Zina stayed alone in the little house. Her grandsons had gone to Minsk to study. Her husband had died back in '89. She wandered from room to room, touching things: her mother's faded shawl, the old chest that held the few pre-war photographs, and the small tin box that once contained lemon drops, always locked with a tiny padlock. Zina had always known her mother never let anyone open that box. That evening, for the first time, she did. The key was in the pocket of Mama's old apron. Inside lay 3 objects: a sliver of gray army soap, almost rotted away, a small folding knife with a rusted blade, and a piece of paper folded 4 times, yellowed, bearing a German stamp. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a list, 5 names written neatly in ink that had browned with age. 1. Hans Weber, born 1914, Vienna. 2. Kurt Lehmann, born 1917, Dresden. 3. Otto Kruger, born 1916, Hamburg. 4. Franz Meyer, born 1920, Munich. 5. Willy Schmidt, born 1918, Cologne.
At the bottom, in her mother's cramped handwriting, "Lord, forgive me for not forgetting." Zina sat until dawn without turning on the light. Then she folded the paper again, locked the box, and put it back in the chest. But she could not unsee it. A year later, in 1992, an elderly German on crutches came to the village looking for his brother's grave near Vyazma. Zina, without knowing why, invited him in for tea. He spoke poor Russian, but clearly enough. He said his brother had served in the very company that was stationed in Novoselki in the spring of '42. Zina poured him another cup and asked softly, "And Franz Meyer, did he survive?" The man froze, looked at her for a long time. "Franz, yes, he lives in Munich, 85 now, retired, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. He often remembers Russia, says he saw things he still can't bring himself to tell his wife." Zina nodded. She walked the visitor to the gate and never thought of him again. In 1995, when the village put up a new memorial to the fallen, Zina brought a small bunch of wildflowers wrapped in old newspaper and laid it at the base. No one understood why. She told no one. In 2000, her eldest grandson, Sergei, a history student at Belarusian State University, asked her straight out, "Grandma, what did great-grandma Anya go through in captivity? She never said a word." Zina looked at him for a long time, then took the tin box from the chest, opened it, and handed him the list. "This is all she left. She never said anything more, and you must never tell anyone. Promise me?" Sergei promised. 5 years later, when he defended his thesis on the occupation of Belarus, he slipped one cautious line into a footnote.
According to the recollections of A.I. Kovaleva, 1900 to 1991, resident of Krasny Bor village, in 1941 to 1943, cases existed of women being kept as common property by Wehrmacht companies. No name, no details. The professor read it, frowned, but did not strike it out. In May 2005, Zina traveled to Minsk to the Eternal Flame. She was 70. Her legs barely carried her. She lit a candle in the little church beside Victory Square and whispered, "Mama, I kept everything safe and I stayed silent, just as you wanted." Then she sat on a bench, took the little folding knife from her purse, the one that had been in the box, looked at it for a long time, and dropped it into a rubbish bin. The blade had broken years ago, yet she had carried it with her for 14 years. Back home in Krasny Bor, a young birch had grown over her mother's grave. Zina went there every Sunday, brought flowers, and sat in silence. Sometimes she murmured, "Forgive me, Mama, for opening it, but I never told another soul, never." The wind in the birch leaves rustled as softly as it had in the summer of 1941, above the cellar where 3 children once hid, and from which their mother was taken forever. That autumn, Zina burned the list of 5 names in the stove. She scattered the ashes over the field where the cow once grazed, where everything had begun. And once again, the village of Krasny Bor fell quiet, as though nothing had ever happened.